The wager. The card hit the table with a sound Luke Calder would carry with him for the rest of his life. Nothing dramatic about it, nothing loud, just final. In that single instant, the grin froze on his face, and everything he had ever known slid right out from under him. The men sitting across were smiling, sure, but not a trace of warmth lived in their eyes. This had stopped being about money a long time ago. What this was about was a lesson. Luke felt it settle deep into his bones before a single word was spoken. By the time the sun went down, he would find himself promised to a woman he hardly knew. By the time it rose again, he would be locked into a fate he had never asked for, standing at an altar he had never once wanted. Luke Calder was about to learn that losing could feel an awful lot like winning, though that truth was still a long way off. Red Hollow had always been the kind of town that suited men like Luke just fine. Fast hands, quick talk, and a confidence that never seemed to run dry. Out there, luck was its own kind of currency, and Luke had spent years burning through his without a second thought. He played cards the way other men worked their cattle. All instinct, all patience, and that easy smile that made people forget to take him seriously. That particular night, he was right where he belonged, tucked into his usual corner of the Rusted Spur saloon, whiskey warm in his hand and lamplight catching the dust in the air. 3 ranchers had sat down across from him, old Eli Mercer and the Boone brothers, men who had bled enough coin at this table to be done with losing gracefully. "You sure about this?" Luke asked lightly, stacking his chips with practiced ease. "Hate to ruin your whole weekend." Eli didn't even blink. "We're sure," the younger Boone spoke next. "We're not playing for money." Luke's fingers went still. "Then what are we playing for?" he asked. Eli leaned in close. "Your freedom." The whole room went quiet. Even the piano stopped. Luke laughed, but it came out thin and hollow. "You've been breathing too much desert air. If we win," Eli continued, steady as ever, "you marry the quietest woman in town. Proper ceremony. No running." The saloon erupted into hushed whispers. Names floated through the air like smoke, but one of them settled heavy and clear above the rest. Hannah Cole. Luke's stomach tightened right up. He'd seen her before, everyone had. Soft-spoken, watchful, always tucked somewhere in the background of her father's dry goods store. A woman built out of silence. "This is madness," Luke said. "Maybe so," Eli replied, "but it's justice." Luke met his eyes. "And if I win?" Eli slid a folded deed across the table without a word. 300 acres, springs, grazing land. Luke's breath caught in his chest. A man could build a whole life on land like that. He should have stood up and walked out the door. Instead, he looked Eli dead in the eye and said, "Deal." As the cards were shuffled and dealt, something unfamiliar crept up Luke's spine. Not fear exactly. Something older. Something that felt a lot like fate. And when the final hand was laid bare and the truth stared back at him, Luke Calder knew one thing with absolute clarity. His luck had finally run all the way out. He stared at the cards like he could change them just by looking hard enough. He couldn't. Eli Mercer calmly spread his hand across the table. A full house, clean and final. The Boone brothers let out low whistles, and the saloon exploded into noise. Laughter, curses, the scrape of chairs as men pushed in to see the wreckage for themselves. Luke felt none of it. The sound faded out, replaced by a hollow ringing somewhere deep in his ears. "You lost," someone said almost gently. Luke swallowed hard. His mouth had gone dry. His whiskey sat untouched. He'd lost before. Money, pride, nights he couldn't piece back together in the morning. But never like this. Never something that couldn't be fixed with another hand. Eli gathered the cards without any hurry. A bet is a bet. Luke forced himself to look up. "You can't make a man get married." Eli's eyes didn't waver. "We didn't make you do anything. You made yourself do it when you said deal." The truth of those words landed hard. In Red Hollow, A man's word was his backbone. Break it, and you didn't just lose respect. You lost your place entirely. When? Luke asked quietly. 6 days, the older Boone replied. Gives folks time to get ready. Time to get ready. As if this were a barn raising, as if it were a funeral. They gathered themselves and left together, and the deed stayed right where it had been, close enough to touch, forever out of reach. The crowd drifted back to their drinks, already turning the night into a story worth telling. Luke stayed in his chair, staring at the empty table, at the exact spot where his life had cracked open. Sal Danner, the bartender, set a fresh bottle down beside him. For what it's worth, he said, Hannah Cole is a good woman. Luke didn't answer. The next morning arrived like a punishment. Sunlight burned through the single window of Luke's rented room above the barber shop, and his head throbbed with regret. For one hopeful breath, he let himself wonder if it had all been some kind of dream. Then came the knock. You decent? He opened the door to find Mrs. Wilkins, the preacher's wife, ledger tucked under one arm, determination written all over her face. It's 9 o'clock, she announced, stepping inside without being invited, scanning the sparse little room with sharp eyes. And we have a wedding to plan. So it was real. You'll need a suit. You'll stand straight. And you will stay sober. Luke nodded numbly. Does she know? He asked. Mrs. Wilkins's expression softened just slightly. Her father told her this morning. Guilt twisted through Luke like a knife. He had been so caught up in his own loss, his own pride, that he hadn't spared a single thought for the woman whose life had just been dragged into his disaster. What's she like? He asked. Mrs. Wilkins paused at the door. Quiet, she said. Not weak. There's a difference. When she left, Luke stood alone in the morning light, sitting with a truth he hadn't expected. Whatever he had thrown away at that card table, Hannah Cole had lost something too. And unlike him, she had never once chosen to play. Luke avoided Cole's dry goods for 3 full days. He told himself it was out of courtesy, giving her space, letting the shock die down. The truth was simpler and less flattering. He was afraid. Red Hollow was far too small a town to hide in forever. On the 4th morning, the last clean shirt he owned lost a button. Luke stared at it, then at his reflection, and finally folded it under his arm like a man surrendering. The bell above the shop door chimed as he stepped inside. The familiar smell of leather and grain wrapped around him. Samuel Cole was behind the counter, eyes cool and measuring. Calder, he said flatly. Luke cleared his throat. I was told your daughter does mending, Mr. Cole. Samuel held still for a moment, then turned toward the back. Hannah. Customer. Footsteps followed. When she appeared in the doorway, Luke felt his breath catch somewhere in his chest. He had seen her before. Passing glances. Nothing more. But never like this. Her dark hair held a hint of copper in the light. Her gray eyes were calm, steady, taking everything in. She wore a simple dress, hands already marked by work. Mr. Calder, she said quietly. Hannah. He held out the shirt. Button came off. She took it. Their fingers brushed. Brief. Electric. Her hands were small and capable and completely still. It'll be ready tomorrow, she said. He should have left right then. Instead, words spilled out of him, rough and unplanned. I'm sorry about the bet. About all of it. Hannah studied him for a long, quiet moment. Are you sorry you made it? She asked. Or sorry you lost? The question hit him somewhere he wasn't expecting. Both, Luke admitted. Something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness, not anger, but something closer to understanding. Or maybe acceptance. I'll have your shirt ready tomorrow, she repeated, and the meaning was clear. Luke nodded and left, his heart pounding in a way he couldn't quite explain. Inside the store, Samuel watched his daughter fold the shirt with careful hands. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I won't force you. Hannah didn't look up. And what happens to him if I refuse? Samuel said nothing. He loses everything, she continued softly. His honor, his place here, his life in this town. That's his own doing, Samuel said. His own choice. We all make choices, Hannah said. Some of us just have fewer of them. She met her father's eyes then, and for the first time, Samuel saw what had been living beneath his daughter's quiet all along. Something solid and steady as iron. The remaining days blurred together. Fittings, paperwork, whispered gossip trailing Luke through town like a second shadow. On the morning of the wedding, he stood in a borrowed suit that made him look like a stranger in his own reflection. The small white church filled right up to the rafters. When the doors opened, Hannah walked down the aisle in pale blue. No flowers. Chin lifted. She did not look frightened. She looked resolved. At the altar, her hand slipped into his, cool, steady. When the preacher spoke the final words, Luke leaned in, intending nothing more than a polite brush of lips. But the moment they touched, something lit up like fire. Hannah gasped softly. Luke pulled back, stunned. That kiss, brief, unexpected, nothing like what it should have been, set something ablaze inside him. And standing there in that little church, he understood with unsettling certainty that this marriage had just become far more dangerous than any card game he had ever played. The applause followed them out of the church, loud and curious, like the whole town was pressing in to breathe down their necks. Hannah kept her hand lightly on Luke's arm, just enough for tradition, not enough to invite anything more. The reception was held exactly where Luke's life had come apart. The rusted spur saloon. Tables pushed together, ribbons hung crooked, food laid out more out of obligation than celebration. Luke tasted none of it. Hannah managed it all better than he did. She smiled when people spoke to her, thanked them softly, and moved through the afternoon with a calm grace that made it look easy, as if this were just another task she had quietly accepted and decided to do well. "You're handling this better than I am," Luke muttered at one point. She glanced at him. "What choice do I have?" By late afternoon, the crowd had thinned, and reality had moved in to take its place. Luke realized he had no home that was fit for two people. Samuel Cole approached, eyes tired but soft, and set a key on the table. Widow Parker's place on Cottonwood Lane. Small, but solid. "Rent's paid through winter. Papa," Hannah began. "Take it," Samuel said gently. He turned to Luke, voice going harder. "You take care of her." "I will," Luke said, and was quietly surprised to find that he meant it. The house was modest. 4 rooms, 1 bedroom. Luke spoke quickly. "I'll take the sofa. This doesn't have to be anything it isn't." "Thank you," Hannah said simply. "I'll make supper." That first night passed in careful silence. Luke lay stiff on the too-short sofa, staring up at the ceiling. From somewhere behind the bedroom door came a sound. Not quite crying, but close enough to reach right through the wall and settle in his chest like a stone. Guilt had never felt quite so heavy. Morning brought harsh sunlight and the ordinary weight of routine. Hannah made coffee. Luke went back to his old room for the rest of his things. Their marriage moved forward like 2 trains running on parallel tracks, close, but never quite touching. Days folded into each other. Luke found work wherever it was offered. Stables, fences, anything honest. Evenings meant quiet meals and polite words, and the careful distance between 2 people still figuring out what they were to each other. 3 weeks in, Samuel stopped by. He stood on the sagging porch, watching Luke wrestle with a board that refused to cooperate. "You being good to my daughter?" he asked. "I'm trying," Luke said. Samuel gave a slow nod. "Marriage needs more than fair. It needs effort." That evening, Luke came home early, stayed, talked, listened. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Luke rebuilt that porch properly, hammered until his hands blistered and his arms burned. When Hannah came out to look it over, she ran a hand along the railing and nodded once. "It's solid," she said. Something warm stirred in his chest at those two simple words. Weeks later, he found her in the garden behind the house, knees pressed into the dirt, hands moving gently through the soil. "Need a hand?" he asked. She hesitated, then held out the watering can. "Slowly," she said. They worked side by side as the sun dropped low, quiet and unhurried. That evening on the porch, Hannah asked, "Tell me something true about yourself." Not cards, Luke thought. He took his time. "I wanted land once, wanted to build something real." She nodded, sitting with that, turning it over. As she rose to go inside, Luke stayed out under the stars. For the first time in his life, losing didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning. Summer pressed down hard on Red Hollow, pushing heat into every crack and corner of the town. The garden behind the house held on by stubborn will alone. Hannah checked it each morning, touching leaves, testing the soil with her fingers. Luke caught himself watching her from the doorway more often than he was willing to admit, noticing the way she became completely present whenever she worked with growing things. It was the small moments that started to get to him. The way she left his coffee strong without ever being asked. The way she mended his shirts before he noticed they needed it. The way she hummed to herself sometimes while she cooked, so softly it barely existed at all. Luke tried, clumsily, to match her quiet effort. He brought home wildflowers, a ribbon from the dry goods shelf he had once seen her linger near. She always thanked him with a small nod and a smile that did something warm and unexpected to the inside of his chest. One afternoon, he came home to empty rooms. A note on the table said she was helping at the church. The house felt hollow without her steady presence in it. He wandered through the rooms, noticing the curtains she had sewn, the care she had put into arranging his few books. On the bed lay one of them, left open, a poem about loneliness. He was still holding it when the door burst open. Hannah stumbled inside, breathing hard. Her dress was torn. Dirt was streaked across her cheek. "What happened?" Luke demanded, crossing the room fast. "There were men at the church," she said, steadying herself. "Thieves." His blood went cold. "I found the rifle," she continued, already moving to wash her face. "Shot one man's hat clean off his head." Luke stared at her. "You did what?" "They left," she said simply. The town talked about it for days. By morning, everyone in Red Hollow knew that the quiet woman could shoot straighter than most men with a badge. Luke watched strangers look at his wife differently after that, looked at her a little differently himself. That night, something between them quietly shifted. He asked her questions, real ones. She answered honestly, telling him about her mother, about the things she hoped for, about wanting to matter in the world. "I see you," Luke said softly. She smiled, but there was a sadness in it. "We're making the best of a hard situation," she said. He didn't argue, but he wasn't sure he agreed anymore. Then came the fire, smoke and shouting and buckets flying through the dark. The shed burned hot and fast, and Luke and Hannah fought it side by side, sweat and soot and fear pulling them closer together than any words had managed to. When the flames finally gave up, the house was still standing. "Our home," Hannah whispered, and the word landed differently than it had before. That night, she stopped him at the sofa. "The bed is big enough," she said quietly. "We're married." They lay apart, both wide awake, breathing the same air. And in the darkness, Luke recognized the truth, quiet and frightening and undeniable. He was falling for his wife. Morning came gentle and honest. Shared coffee, a new kind of closeness, and a new kind of tension underneath it. Days later, trouble rode into town from the hills. Rustlers, guns, men with nothing to lose. The town formed up a posse, and Luke rode out scared and shaking, thinking only of Hannah waiting for him back at the house. When he returned safe, she came apart. She held him and told him she loved him, and the words broke something open inside him. Luke kissed her the way a man kisses someone when he finally stops running, with everything he had, wild and certain. Later, lying in the quiet, Luke made himself a vow. He would never choose cards over this, not ever again. Peace never lasted long in Red Hollow. 2 weeks after the night Hannah told him she loved him, Luke stayed late at the stables, hands aching, shirt soaked through. When the sun finally slipped away, his feet carried him past the rusted spur before his mind had a chance to catch up. He stopped at the open doors. He could hear it, cards shuffling, chips clicking, laughter drifting out into the warm night air. Just watching, he told himself. Just for a minute. Inside, the table welcomed him like an old friend. A chair scraped back. Someone grinned. One hand, someone called out. He should have turned around and walked straight home. Instead, he sat down. The cards felt right, then more than right. He won small, then bigger. The old thrill came roaring back, warm and dangerous, filling up spaces he had almost forgotten were there. For a little while, life made a certain kind of sense again. Odds and instincts and the clean satisfaction of control. Then the room went quiet. Hannah was standing in the doorway. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, and the disappointment in her eyes cut deeper than any loss he had ever taken at any table. "I came because you didn't come home," she said softly. "After what happened with the rustlers, I was afraid for you." Luke stood fast. "Hannah, don't," she said. "Don't explain it. Don't make promises." She looked past him at the table. "That's who you were. I won't spend my life competing with it." The words landed like a verdict. "Choose," she said. "Me or this." Then she turned and walked out. Luke looked down at the cards in his hands. They meant absolutely nothing. He pushed his winnings forward across the table. "Keep it," he said. "All of it." And then he ran. He found her halfway down Main Street, shoulders shaking in the dark. "I'm done," he said, breathless from running. I walked away. She turned, tears shining in the lamplight. How am I supposed to believe that? "You can't," Luke said honestly, "but I know it." He took her hands in both of his. "That kiss you gave me at the altar, the one that set my whole soul on fire, that's what I choose. Every single time." Silence stretched long and thin between them. Then Hannah stepped closer. "Then act like it," she said. He kissed her right there in the open, under the wide sky, in front of anyone who happened to be watching, choosing her like he meant it, because he did. Morning came honest and bright. Coffee, quiet smiles, a shared bed without the careful distance. That afternoon, Eli Mercer rode up to the house. He stepped down from his horse and handed Luke a folded deed. "The ranch," Eli said. "You earned it." Luke stared at the paper. "I lost the bet." "You won the lesson," Eli replied. Luke brought it home to Hannah. She studied it carefully, then looked up with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "For us," she said. "Yes," Luke agreed. "For us." That night, they sat together and planned a future neither one of them had ever imagined. And Luke finally understood something he should have known a long time ago. The hardest game he had ever played had nothing to do with cards. It was choosing the same woman, the same life, the same thing. Every single day. They left Cottonwood Lane at the end of summer. Everything they owned fit into one wagon. A few trunks, some tools, sacks of seed. Hannah sat beside Luke on the bench, the deed folded carefully in her lap, like something both fragile and powerful all at once. The land waited for them out beyond the low hills, raw, quiet, and honest. Luke reined in when they reached the rise Hannah had pointed out weeks earlier. From up there, the springs glinted in the sun, and grass pushed stubbornly through dry soil. "Here," Hannah said simply. "This is where we build." Luke looked out over it and saw it immediately. Not just a house, but a life stretching forward as far as the eye could go. They lived in a tent that first month. The nights were cold. The days were relentless. Luke built the cabin board by board, learning as he went, his hands splitting and bleeding, his back screaming at him every morning. But each beam he put up stood solid. Hannah made the place feel like home before it even had proper walls. Curtains sewn from scraps, meals cooked over open fire, a garden planted in soil that barely wanted to cooperate. The work was brutal. The reward was real. Some mornings Luke woke up crushed under the weight of everything still left to do. Fences, cattle, repairs that never seemed to end. But Hannah would put her hand on his shoulder and say quietly, "One thing at a time." So he did. They argued sometimes, about money, about exhaustion, about fears neither one of them wanted to name out loud. But they learned how to fight without destroying each other, how to stop, how to sit with it, how to really listen. In late winter, Hannah stopped him one evening as they sat beside the fire. "There's something you need to know," she said. Luke felt his chest tighten. "All right." She took his hand and placed it gently against her belly. "We're going to have a baby." The world tilted. Luke sank to his knees in front of her, laughter and tears arriving at the same time. "Are you sure?" She smiled. "Very." Fear came later, but first came joy. Spring arrived, carrying wildflowers and pain and hope. Their daughter came into the world on a warm April morning, loud and stubborn and absolutely perfect. "Grace," Luke whispered. Hannah nodded, eyes wet and bright. "Grace." Samuel Cole made the trip out to the ranch and held his granddaughter with shaking hands. Even Eli Mercer showed up, nodding once in that careful way of his, like approval was something he only gave when it truly counted. Years passed. The ranch grew. So did their family. Luke never touched cards again. Not once. Sometimes passing through town, he would stop outside the saloon for just a moment. The old pull was gone, replaced by something sturdier, something that hadn't needed luck to build. One evening on the porch, Hannah leaned into his side. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. Luke pressed a kiss into her hair. "Only that I didn't lose sooner." She laughed, soft and warm. They watched their children play as the sun went down, the land spreading wide and free all around them. Luke Calder had lost everything at a card table and gained a life worth more than winning. The ranch settled into its own rhythm, shaped by seasons instead of chance. Mornings began before the sun was up. Luke worked the fences and tended the cattle, learning the land the hard way, one mistake at a time. Hannah tended the garden, bigger now, greener than it had any right to be out here, moving through the days with steady purpose, Grace tied to her chest in a sling, humming those soft tunes Luke had quietly come to love. It wasn't easy. Money stayed tight. Storms tore through fences they had just repaired. One winter nearly wiped out half their herd. Luke lay awake on those nights staring at the cabin ceiling, wondering if he had just traded one kind of gamble for another. But when doubt crept in, Hannah never wavered. "We'll adjust," she would say. "We always do." Word of the ranch spread slowly, not because it was the biggest or the richest spread in the territory, but because it endured. Because Luke paid his debts on time. Because Hannah traded produce and eggs instead of gossip. Because when they gave their word, it meant something. One afternoon, Luke rode into Red Hollow for supplies and passed the rusted spur without slowing down. No pull, no itch. Just a memory, distant and dull. Sal Danner stood outside, wiping his hands on a towel. "Heard you're doing well out there," he said. Luke nodded. "Doing honest," Sal smiled. "Suits you." When Luke rode home, Hannah was waiting on the porch, Grace toddling at her feet, already working on Stubborn. "Welcome home," Hannah said. He kissed her. "Always good to be back." That evening, rocking side by side in the fading light, Hannah spoke softly. "I used to think silence kept me safe. Now I know it only kept me small." Luke listened the way he had learned to. "I found my voice out here," she continued. "With you." Luke took her hand. You found mine too. Years layered themselves gently over the land. More children came, 2 sons with Hannah's eyes and Luke's stubborn grin. The cabin grew, the barn grew, the land answered back everything they put into it. One summer evening, as the sky burned orange all across the horizon, Luke stood and watched his family move through the yard. Hannah directing the children, Grace chasing chickens. Laughter carried easy on the breeze. He thought about the man he had been, the man who had believed luck was something you took. He understood now that it was something else entirely. Luck was something you built, something you chose, deliberately, every single day. That night, he held Hannah close and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." She smiled in the dark, her voice certain and warm. "Thank you for choosing me." The desert stretched quiet and endless around them, cradling a story that had started with a wager and been kept alive by a promise, chosen again and again in every ordinary moment between them. Time did what nothing else could manage. It softened the sharp edges. The ranch no longer felt new or uncertain. It felt lived in, trusted. The land bore the marks of everything they had put into it. Fences worn smooth from years of repair. Paths pressed deep into the dirt by countless footsteps. Trees planted small now offering real shade on hot afternoons. Luke grew into the work, not quickly, not easily, but fully. He learned the moods of cattle, the language of clouds, the patience required when the desert refused to cooperate. He learned that some days success meant real progress, and other days it simply meant you had made it through. Hannah remained the quiet center of everything. She ran the household with steady authority, managed the accounts, planned the plantings, and taught their children with a firmness that never forgot to be gentle. Grace followed her everywhere, watchful and strong-willed, while the boys learned early on that their mother's quiet was never, ever to be mistaken for softness. One evening, a dust storm rolled in off the flats without any warning at all. Wind howled. Sand scoured everything raw. Luke and Hannah worked side by side, securing shutters, calming the animals, holding their ground together while the world outside raged against them. Afterward, exhausted and coated in grit, Luke let out a soft, tired laugh. "I used to think chaos was something worth chasing," he said. Hannah wiped her hands clean. "Now you build against it." He had no argument with that. That night, with the children asleep, Luke said something he had been carrying quietly for a long time. "I still think about the cards sometimes." Hannah didn't flinch. "I know. But it's different now," he said. "It doesn't own me." She nodded slowly. "Temptation doesn't disappear. It just loses its power. In Red Hollow, stories had a long life. People still talked about the gambler who had become a rancher, about the quiet woman who could outwork any man in the county, about a marriage that had begun as punishment and turned into something rare and lasting. Luke came back to town less often as the years went on. When he did ride in, he felt like a visitor passing through someone else's story. The saloon was just a building now. The table just wood. Home was waiting miles away, and that was exactly where he wanted to be. One late afternoon, Grace, grown tall and serious, and more like her mother every year, looked up at him from the porch steps and asked, "Papa, how did you meet Mama?" Luke smiled. "I lost," he said simply. Hannah, coming through the door at that exact moment, caught his eye. That night, the two of them sat on the porch watching stars come out one by one, slow and certain. "You don't regret any of it," Hannah said. "Not quite a question." Luke shook his head. "Not for a single second." The desert breathed around them, wide and patient. And Luke Calder knew that whatever storms still lay out ahead of them, he would face every last one the same way he had learned to face everything else. Steady, present, and never alone. Years later, Red Hollow was still telling the story. They spoke of the gambler who had lost everything on a reckless bet, of the quiet woman no one had truly seen until she decided to stand her ground. of a marriage born from obligation that had somehow outlasted and outshone most of the ones that had started with love. Luke heard the stories sometimes when he rode into town. He never bothered to correct them. The truth was quieter than that. It lived in the early mornings when he and Hannah worked side by side without needing to speak, understanding each other without words. In the way Grace had grown to mirror her mother's steadiness. In the sons who followed Luke out through the fields, asking questions about soil and stars and why some fences held longer than others. One autumn afternoon, Luke rode past the rusted spur again. He stopped, not from temptation, but from something more like curiosity. Sal Danner stood in the doorway, older now, slower in his movements. "You ever miss it?" Sal asked. Luke thought of Hannah's hands in the garden, of laughter inside the cabin, of work that meant something at the end of the day. "No," Luke said simply. Sal nodded like he had already known the answer. Figured as much. That winter was a hard one. Snow stayed longer than anyone expected. Supplies ran lean. Luke and Hannah had one real argument, about whether to sell off cattle or hold through the worst of it. But they didn't break. They talked it through. They listened to each other. And then they chose each other, same as always, and moved forward together. Spring came back the way it always did. New calves, new growth. Grace shot up tall. The boys learned early what responsibility felt like. Hannah's garden stretched further now than Luke had ever thought possible when they first broke ground. One evening, sitting together by the fire with the house quiet around them, Hannah said softly, "Do you ever think about who you might have been if you'd won that hand?" Luke took his time with the answer. "I think I'd still be running," he said at last. "Winning doesn't teach you how to stay." She leaned into him, something settling in her that looked a lot like peace. When Luke looked at Hannah now, he didn't see the quietest woman in Red Hollow. He saw the strongest one he had ever known. That kiss at the altar, the one that had stunned him so completely, had been a warning, and a promise, and a beginning all at once. Not wild, because it was reckless, but because it was honest all the way through. As the fire crackled low, Luke reached for Hannah's hand. "I'd lose again," he said quietly. "Every single time." She smiled, not loud, not showy, just certain. Outside, the ranch rested under a wide and open sky, built from choices made daily, deliberately, with care. The story people told would always start with a gamble. But Luke knew exactly where it truly ended, with a man who had learned how to choose love, and who never stopped choosing it. Age came softly to the Calder ranch, not all at once, and not with warning, but in small, honest ways. Luke noticed it first in his hands, the old scars still there, but his grip not quite as quick as it once was. Hannah noticed it in the quiet moments, the way he paused before lifting heavy things, the way he rested a little longer in the evenings. Neither one of them spoke of it for a while. Life continued on. Grace had grown into a woman with her mother's steady eyes and her father's stubborn heart. The boys had followed the land, one drawn to cattle, one to building. The ranch endured, not because it had grown beyond all recognition, but because it had been cared for every single day. One late summer afternoon, Luke settled into his chair on the porch while Hannah worked in the garden. He watched her move between the rows, calm and deliberate, still as capable as the day she had first pressed a watering can into his hands and told him to go slowly. "You ever wish you'd talked more when you were young?" he asked. She smiled without looking up. "No. Silence taught me who was worth listening to." Luke sat with that. He understood it now. Visitors came sometimes, travelers, young couples hoping to start something of their own out on the land. They would ask Luke for whatever advice he had to give. "Don't chase luck," he would tell them. "Build something you're willing to stay with." One evening, after the children had all settled into their own lives and the house had gone quiet in a new way, Luke and Hannah sat alone on the porch. The land stretched out before them, familiar and deep. "Do you remember the altar?" Hannah asked. Luke chuckled softly. I remember thinking I had ruined both our lives. And now? He turned and looked at her. Now I know that losing saved me. She leaned her head against his shoulder, in the same place she had always found comfort, the place that had been hers for longer than he could properly remember. The desert wind moved easy through the grass. Stars appeared, one by one. Luke thought of the man he had been, restless, chasing winds that never lasted, burning through luck like it would never run out. And he thought of the woman beside him, quiet, fierce, patient beyond any measure he had ever known. He hadn't been tamed. He had been taught how to belong. As the night deepened around them, Luke felt something settle inside him that he had no better word for than peace. Not fear, not regret, just peace. If tomorrow came, he would meet it the same way he had met every day since that first wild kiss at the altar, standing beside Hannah, choosing her every single time. The last chapter of Luke Calder's life did not arrive with drama. It came quietly, the way all true things did. One spring morning he sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching Hannah move through the garden. Her hair had gone silver at the temples. Her steps were slower, but no less sure. She paused to straighten a row of herbs, pressing the soil just so, the same way she always had. "You're watching again," she said without turning. "I like the view," Luke replied. She smiled and came to sit beside him. The ranch stretched out before them, the fields they had shaped with their own hands, fences repaired 100 times over, trees planted small now casting real shade. Grace's children were laughing somewhere near the barn. Life moved forward, steady and full. Luke laced his fingers through Hannah's. "Do you ever think about that bet?" he asked. She considered it. "Only as a doorway," she said. Luke nodded slowly. "I thought it was a punishment." "It was," she said gently, "just not the kind anyone expected." He laughed softly, then coughed. Hannah squeezed his hand without making a thing of it, grounding him the way she always had. "I wasn't a good man when this started," Luke said. "I was loud and careless and always running." "You learned," she replied. "Because of you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she had at the altar all those years ago. Calm. Certain. "No," she said, "because you chose to stay." The sun dipped lower, bathing the land in gold. Luke felt the weight of all those years settle over him. Not heavy, not frightening. Earned. "If I had one more hand to play," he said quietly, "I'd fold." Hannah smiled. "You already won." That night, Luke slept easily with Hannah's hand resting over his heart, and before dawn, with the desert still holding its breath, he slipped away, the same way he had learned to live, peacefully, present, loved. Red Hollow buried him on a hill overlooking the land he had built. People came from miles around. They spoke of the gambler who had changed, the quiet woman who had saved him, the kiss that had started everything. Hannah stood tall through all of it, her grief carried with the same quiet dignity she had brought to everything in her life. When it was over, she went home, sat down on the porch, and listened to the land breathe. Luke was everywhere. In the garden, in the fences, in the laughter of children running through the yard. Years later, when Hannah was laid beside him on that same hill, people said the story had finally come to its end. But it hadn't. It lived on in every choice made with patience, in every love chosen daily, in every life built deliberately instead of gambled away on a hope and a prayer. Because that wild kiss had never really been about passion. It had been about awakening and freedom and a love that had absolutely refused to die.